It's Soteriology 101. Sit back, learn, and have some fun. With your host, Leighton Flowers, you'll discuss some divine powers. Welcome if you like John Piper, as long as you're not too hyper. We're diving into soteriology, Calvinism and theology. Learn from a professor of a college class. The captive audience is predestined to last.
All right. Welcome to Soteriology 101. That, as you can see, sitting with me is Eric Kemp. Welcome, Eric, to the program.
Thanks for having me.
I couldn't help but play the little jingle. That was a little jingle that somebody wrote for me back when the first 3 months of my program, and somebody
it
on
should
Fiverr,
stay there. It should stay back there.
It should stay back there.
It should just.
But it had the word hyper in it. And I couldn't pass it up because
fine.
Even if you like John Piper, as long as you're not too hyper, it's gold, man. It's pure gold.
That phrase makes it worth it. All right, fine. I see what you're saying. By the way, I do have to say that I'm super jealous of your quarantine hair. This is out of. I'm going to buzz this. This is so out of control.
My daughter cut my hair for me. Can you believe that? First time to cut hair. She cuts my dog's hair. And so I figure she has at least some experience, and I wanted my wife and I to be able to still, be okay with one another. And so it was better for my daughter to do it than my wife.
It's a smart marriage decision.
This is a very, very smart decision.
My daughter is 7. Could she cut my hair?
I think you should try it on air while we're watching. Matter of fact, we can just say, what does God predestined for your head to look like? And we'll just do a whole episode on Eric.
Just hand her the clippers and just go, look,
just go at it.
God's hands.
Just say, honey, it's predestined what's going to look like anyway. So you just go for it. So that's great. Well, those that don't know Eric, anybody, I don't know where you've been if you don't know who Eric Kemp is, because Eric has been with us for several years now here at Soteriology 101.
Has been.
And helping us writing articles and kind of keeping things somewhat organized on the social media pages and all the fun stuff that we deal with on a regular basis. And so whenever you try to contact me and I don't reply, it's really Eric's fault. That's pretty much what I'm announcing right now. So if you have any problems whatsoever with my lack of response to you, it's really this guy right here's fault.
That's 100% accurate. There's nothing I can say about that.
So that's fun stuff. Well, we are watching side chat. I have it there on the side. And Eric, you can actually, if you take it off a private chat and click on public chat there in the top right corner,
we go.
You can see people's chat as well. I don't know that you can actually type in on there. That's an unfortunate characteristic of StreamYard, is that my guest can't type in.
I don't think you want me to. I think that's
you don't want you type it in. Well, the reason I wanted to do this broadcast is because Eric has written a 2-part series. It's actually going to be a 3-part series. He's working on the 3rd part, where he's going on a journey during this. Yes, it was a great pose, by the way. I loved it. He is going on a journey to hunt for a very elusive, very hard to spot. I mean, this is worse than the Loch Ness Monster. This is worse than Bigfoot.
It's the reformed Sasquatch.
It is the reformed Sasquatch. That's what this is. This is the elusive Hyper-Calvinist. And so we're on quarantine. So Eric just figures, I'm going to go searching for this beast because it has to be out there somewhere. And
it's so alone anyway. It's wherever I go, I'm by myself. So it's fine. I'm social distancing where I go when I try to go look for him.
It's easy to social distance from Hyper-Calvinist, isn't it?
That's right.
It's just the easiest thing. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is 1, what is a Hyper-Calvinist? And then 2, where are they? And then 3, how could that possibly inform us with regard to the ever so often heard accusation of misrepresentation from our Calvinist friends? Because many of you who've been around long enough know that we are accused quite regularly of not representing Calvinism correctly. Which we have to remind Calvinists and our friends who are Calvinists who have joined us. You're always welcome here. Just stay cordial, and you can stay around forever. If you're just nice, we'll let you get away with anything. Just be nice and stay as long as you like. Ask questions, push back, whatever those kinds of things are. That's fine. Just be a Christ-like person. That's all we ask. And we also ask for those on our provisionist side, please do the same.
Oh, I've banned so many non-Calvinists.
You've probably banned more non-Calvinists than you have Calvinists.
Way more.
Some of them are really, really mean, unfortunately. Guys, let me just say something on that real quick, because Eric is also helps us with moderating, along with about 5 or 6 other people, moderating the chat. And poor guy, I'm so sorry I gave you that task. I'm sure you appreciate having the fun responsibility of looking over people's.
You get like your skin just gets thicker. Like you develop like this Iron Man armor. You just kind of put on. You know what I mean? You press the button and it just zzz, and then you like deal with it, and then you just take it off, and it's fine.
Okay, so let me just address this for a second before we get going on this hyper-Calvinist hunt. Okay, if we truly believe that free will exists, which we do, and we believe that Calvinists have free will, don't you think it's good to probably try to persuade them using respect and argumentation that's sound and reasonable? It just makes more sense. Now, they may believe everything's predestined, so they don't really care how they treat people or whatever. I'm not saying Calvinists really do that. Some of them may be that way, and they may be really rough around the edges. I know, I've heard them. Trust me, I hear it a lot. But we believe that we can actually persuade people who were like me once. I was a 5-point Calvinist, staunch Calvinist. I want to try to persuade them, and I can't do that if you're shouting them down, calling them heretics, and running them off. Okay, so be nice to our Calvinist friends, for my sake, if nobody else's. There's a lot of other pages out there that rail on Calvinists and call them all kinds of names. Go over there and just say whatever you want to about them. I don't care. I mean, well, I do care, but I can't control those pages. So just on my page, the Soteriology 101 page, I am beseeching you on behalf of Eric and the others that moderate the chat. Just be kind, just be nice. That's an important note to make as we start off this thing. So
Eric, I'll say is you don't realize how many lurking on the fence Calvinists there are out there. And I get the privilege of seeing the messages all the time that, talk about how the ministry has helped them to either moderate their Calvinism or to stop being Calvinists. And they'll just lurk and they won't say anything and they'll just watch. And if you're mean, that just confirms everything they're already told about us. And they go, yep, see, they're the bad guys, so I don't need to listen to them. But if they're nice, they kind of like can't. If you're nice, they kind of can't call you the bad guy. Like by being, I'll put it a little bit more strongly. By being mean, you're giving them what they want, which is an excuse to not listen to you anymore. They want a reason to be able to discount the arguments you're making and what you're saying. And if you're rude, they just go, yep, see, see, all my friends are right. Everything I read is right. These guys are the bad guys. And I don't need to listen to them because look how mean they are. But you don't, how many times, and I'm kind of bad cop. Like we have, you talk about the other admins and moderators of the group. We have like this little side chat. We all have nicknames. I'm bad cop, right? So I'm not even the nicest one. I'm kind of the one that like sometimes I feel like
you got to drop the hammer when it.
Sometimes I feel like I got to drop the hammer. So I'm kind of they're super nice, and I just go nope, that's too much, and I just go nope, and I'm kind of bad cop. So there are people that are so you can't imagine how many times I see someone, Drew, Jenna, these moderators who are like, you're so nice. Now I listen to what you're saying. Yeah, it happens all the time.
Well, even in the side chat, look, there's Christina right there. She's saying exactly, being nice is what got my attention. Because that's one of the things, honestly, one of the reasons I continue to engage with the Dividing Line program. I try not to mention too many names, you know who I'm talking about, but because the contrast is really so stark that I continually get new followers and new reform or new former Calvinists coming over saying, I really thought Calvinism was what the Bible's teaching, but when I heard contrasted with your discussions with other people, it made me at least open to hear. And so it really does make a difference when you can show some level of respect to people and recognize that they're well-intending. Calvinists, for the most part, are trying to interpret the scriptures rightly. They are trying to understand what the Bible teaches. They probably think, like I used to think, that Arminians are just emotional people that just can't handle the hard teachings of predestination and those kinds of things. And so they really do think that they're defending the inspiration of Scripture and the glory of God. And so they have good intentions. Obviously, we think they're wrong in their interpretation. But keep in mind, when your kid or a friend or a neighbor, if they do something wrong, but they mean well, doesn't that help you to treat them a little bit more with patience, to say, okay, they meant well when they did that, but they just have a wrong perspective here, and so that makes a big difference for sure. Well, let's just get into this discussion. And there's a lot of questions on the side chat, and I will try to pull some of those in as we go. And if it's related to what we're discussing at the moment, so that'll kind of gear you in. If you comment on something that we said 10 minutes ago, I may not be able to pull it in, but if you comment on something we're talking about in the moment, I will try to pull it in, especially if it helps guide the conversation. So I appreciate those who are posting already. And I appreciate the willingness to push back even on what we're saying as you speak. I welcome being pushed back on. So, Eric, tell us, in your hunt here, first of all, you probably need a good working definition. What is this elusive hyper-Calvinist anyway?
Yeah, I've seen a few definitions, but usually they surround and different writers that I'm authors, theologians that I'm reading kind of put different emphasis on things and add little aspects of what a hyper-Calvinist is. Basically, a hyper-Calvinist is anyone who takes Calvinism too far. So they overemphasize the decretive will of God, the secret will of God. They overemphasize it to the detriment of His commands. His prescriptive versus
prescriptive versus decretive will. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Revealed versus secret. They overemphasize the secret will to the detriment of the revealed will. They overemphasize His sovereignty to the detriment of man's responsibility. They overemphasize election to the detriment of the well-meant offer of the gospel. And so then what hyper-Calvinists will do is they'll say, like, there's no point in offering the gospel. In fact, you shouldn't offer the gospel to people. They can't respond and they can't do that. So that's out of bounds, and we don't do that sort of thing. And so that's what hyper-Calvinists, that's the definition of hyper-Calvinists I've seen that they give. They go too far. They've overemphasize.
They've out Calvin John Calvin. And so, it may be, and it seems like to me, I don't know what you've seen in your reading of this, Eric, but it almost seems like it's almost like the scale in the political world. You have, if you're in the political world, you've got someone who's a conservative, but anybody to the left of them is a liberal. Anybody to the right of them is
a white
nationalist or a white nationalist or whatever. Yeah. There's, and so we do this in the theological world too, on different viewpoints. And it seems like on this particular scale of quote unquote Calvinism, i.e. sovereignty, i.e. free will, all those kinds of things, wherever you are on that pendulum,
right?
It's like whoever's to the left of you, that spectrum, whoever's to the left of you, I'll just call them a hyper-Calvinist. And so that whatever accusations people are bringing against those people to the left of me, I'll just say, well, that's not my fault. That's their fault. That's their problem.
So that's what I would
see as a Pelagian or semi-Pelagian.
That's what I would see. Right. So that's exactly what they do. And so I've long thought that, and I know you've gone over this a bunch about, how the Pelagian, semi-Pelagian thing is just, a boogeyman to label someone and so that you no longer have to listen to them. So I was looking at this and going, okay, so then if I bring a criticism of Reformed theology and you say, oh, that's hyper-Calvinism, okay, who is a hyper-Calvinist then? And what are they saying then? Like if my criticism is off I have bad aim on my criticism. My criticism is off. I've aimed my criticism in the wrong place. And it actually should be on the hyper-Calvinist who says these things, okay? Who says these things? No one. They can't. I'm talking about the most cordial, respectful, intelligent Calvinists that I have dialogue with. They cannot or will not name anyone who says these things. There's no Hyper-Calvinist church. There's no Hyper-Calvinist pastor. They don't identify this way. They don't use those words. They don't say they're a Hyper-Calvinist, and they can't name one who they think goes too far. Here's a guy who goes too far. They won't do it. I can't tell you how many times I've asked. So then my thought process was, okay, so then why? Why do they use this? If those people don't exist in the real world, if it's the Reformed Sasquatch and I can't find one, why do they use this term Hyper-Calvinism? And my thesis was, what I went into in writing these things was my idea that I wanted to see if it was true or untrue. I wanted somebody to prove me wrong. Was that they use it to control the language, number one. So that's not Reformed theology. That's Hyper-Calvinism. That's not Calvinism. That's Hyper-Calvinism. So they control the language, and what that does is that allows them to punt to Hyper-Calvinism, transferring the criticism of Reformed theology onto some scapegoat, so then you never have to actually deal with the criticism.
Right.
So I bring a criticism, you don't rationally deal with it, you just go, and you dismiss it off to these other people who don't actually exist, and then you never actually have to answer the criticism or deal with it. So that's what I thought was happening, and then I looked into these articles, and that's exactly what they do.
So somebody on the side chat mentions Westboro Baptist, but here's what I would even. Westboro Baptist is such an extreme, fringe group, but at the same time, usually when I was a Calvinist, and I heard the word Hyper-Calvinist, immediately I would think anti-evangelistic. That's what I equated with Hyper-Calvinism was. If you're anti-evangelistic, then you're a Hyper-Calvinist. Anti-evangelistic meaning you don't believe that we need to evangelize anyone because God's already predetermined who's going to be saved anyway. Who are you to interfere with his sovereign plan? He's going to do whatever he wants to do. And if he wants to save somebody, he's going to save them. And that's what I equated with Hyper-Calvinist, which within the main Orthodox Christian circles, you don't see anybody. At least I don't see anybody who actually goes around saying, hey, we shouldn't evangelize. Even the Westboro Baptists are standing on street corners with signs. Now, the signs may be horrific, but they're evangelizing. They are trying to tell people about their worldview and their view of God. There's no lack of desire to recruit people from that group. So even the anti-evangelistic label doesn't really fit even Westboro Baptist. You would almost just call them, and a lot of times Calvinists don't even want the name Calvinism associated with somebody like the Westboro Baptist, even though they affirm Calvinistic doctrine. And so that kind of seems like with the quandary you get into that you're talking about, it's like pinning the Jello to the wall, because if you found a group that you think, oh, well, this is the epitome, this must be extreme Hyper-Calvinist, but yet they don't even fit the definition of anti-evangelistic, which is the most common, I guess, adjective for those who are, I think
that I stayed away from associating anything Calvinism with Westboro Baptist, because that immediately just poisons the well. Like it's a boogeyman that everybody thinks are a bunch of bad actors, and you sort of I think that shuts we were talking about being charitable and shutting off people's minds. I think that shuts off people's minds immediately if you mention those guys. So I kind of stayed away from, well, they're Hyper-Calvinist or Westboro Baptist and they're consistent Reformed, and try to go in that direction. I just didn't really want to go there, just because that's such a toxic name. So I just wanted to hear what they were saying, from themselves. If they brought up Reform, Westboro Baptists, if Challies or Rob Johnson or somebody had, Michael Horton had brought up Westboro Baptist, I'd have been like, okay, yeah, I mean, great, let's talk about them. But they didn't. So
right. I'm just interjecting here from the side chat. Says what Flowers, and I would guess you too. I don't know why he's just blaming me. I mean, you're the one who wrote the articles, so I don't know why
you get all the blame.
I know.
Yeah,
what's
that's
wrong
fine.
with that? You do something like this,
look,
and
hey,
then I get the blame. So what Flowers is doing here is like a Calvinist trying to attribute open deism or open theism, I guess is what they mean, to him. So how would you respond to that if somebody says, "Hey, Kemp, you're doing exactly what the Calvinists are trying to do when they're trying to call us open theists"?
Yeah, I'm not even calling Reformed Calvinists Hyper-Calvinists. Haven't done that once, and I don't do that once in my articles. I completely, and I'm glad for this question because then I get to clarify. I totally accept that Reformed folks are saying, "Hey, I think we should evangelize. Hey, I don't think that we should not follow God's commands, or admit that we can't follow God's commands, or some overemphasis on the secret will of God, or some man isn't responsible for what I do, so I can do whatever I want because I'm not responsible." I totally accept that Reformed folks aren't doing that. I'm glad Reformed folks aren't doing that, and I completely accept and agree that Reformed folks are sincerely saying, "I don't believe those things." That's fine. That's not the criticism that we bring about Hyper-Calvinism. That's not the criticism. We aren't saying you are Hyper-Calvinist, you don't evangelize. Obviously, they do evangelize. That's of course true. I'm thankful that they do. I'm glad that they are like that. There's a description that Rob Johnson gives. I keep saying Rob Johnson. Phil Johnson. Phil Johnson gives in his article that he's like, well, Hyper-Calvinist churches tend to become like this. I'm glad that the vast majority of Reformed churches aren't like that. That's great, and I'm so happy they're not. The criticism that we bring is that it is consistent with your theology. You don't believe it. Your churches don't act like it. You don't act like it. Totally acceptable. Now tell me how it's irrational and inconsistent with your actual theology. Let's have a discussion about how it doesn't logically lead to that. Now, this Calvinist Michael Horton, in his article, that's my part 2 article, Michael Horton admits that this is our argument. So Michael Horton, not me, Michael Horton admits that our criticism is that Calvinism logically leads to this a lack of impetus to evangelize.
Right.
That it logically leads to an overemphasis in the sovereignty of God.
If you live out the implications of your systematic,
yes,
then it could lead people to be
and pointing out you fervent. Don't live out those right. is fine, but that doesn't answer the criticism. I accept you don't, but it doesn't answer the criticism. So Michael Horton admits that's our criticism. Right. So there are Reformed scholars out there who admit that that's what we're saying, and we're not equating all people with Calvinists with Hyper-Calvinists. We're not saying, hey, you don't evangelize. We're not equating the two, but we're saying it is a logical ends argument. He acknowledges that. So that is what I'm saying.
And that's what I would push back on. By the way, thanks to Frank and Tim, both who made donations. Appreciate that. And that's what I'd push back on. There's a clear definition of someone who holds to open theism, for example. It's clearly what they're denying. They would say we do not believe God has exhaustive knowledge of every man's choices in the future, or something of that nature. They may have a nuanced way of defining that. And whereas I would hold to a view that would say I still do affirm omniscience and even future free choices of creatures. And so there's a clear distinction there. And I can point to you actual open theist scholars like Greg Boyd. Where can you do that within the Calvinistic, Hyper-Calvinistic distinction? That's, I think, the point that
that's exactly it. Where is the actual rational objective distinction? The distinction with a difference. What is the actual difference in the theology? And honestly, the article that's going to be coming, and these two, all they did was argue. And this is Michael Horton, this is Tim Challies, right? These are, the upper echelon of thinkers. I actually like Michael Horton a lot, and their argument is just, well, you just ought not to go that far, and it's like, that's great. That doesn't answer the criticism.
Well, and what's ironic about that to me, Eric, is that the only reason that people would go that far is if God decreed them to go that far. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but it's true. It seems like even under the moderate kind of Calvinist perspective, unless they affirm libertarian freedom of the will and not the sovereign decree, which I don't know how you call that person a Calvinist by any stretch of the word, but nevertheless, if you've got a situation where a person believes all things come to pass, like the Westminster says, according to divine decree, then the only difference between those who adopt Calvinism, who become hyper or anti-evangelistic, and those who adopt Calvinism who don't become hyper and are evangelistic, is the fact that God's decreed for these people to be anti-evangelistic and these people to be evangelistic. Am I missing something there? Is that inaccurate?
No, and in fact, those are some of the questions I have for Michael Horton in one of my articles. Is that, could it be that we have the same goal? Okay, that we want to rightly balance the fact that God is sovereign over creation, whatever that, we can discuss what that means, but that God is in ultimate authority over creation, and that man is responsible. We share the same goal. This is what we want. But when you say, could it be, this is my question for our Reformed audience here, for Michael Horton specifically, my question is, could it be that once the Westminster Confession of Faith says, God from all eternity did by most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeable ordain whatsoever may come to pass, that as long as you say that, as long as you affirm that, then even if you say and believe, yet so as thereby neither is the God of author of sin. So even if you believe that he does so somehow, in some way, without being the author of sin, could it be that our criticism is, once you say the first part, just saying the second part doesn't make it so? That once you say the first part, the fact that God is the author of sin, ordains evil, however you want to put it, that logically follows after the first statement, even if you affirm it doesn't, even if you claim it doesn't. That is what our criticism is.
It's kind of like, to me, it kind of sounds like you're saying, in one sentence, you're saying, bachelors are not married, but bachelors have a wife.
Right. And so if you acknowledge that that's our criticism, then you would have to answer the criticism in some other way besides saying, yeah, but I don't believe God is the author of sin, or he does it somehow without being the author of sin. That doesn't answer the criticism. That doesn't assuage the logical train you set in motion. And right. I've never heard an answer to that.
The difference between the anti-evangelistic Calvinist and the evangelistic Calvinist is not their belief. Both of them believe they're virtually the same thing. In other words, they're both affirming the same thing, because you'll hear a lot of times you'll hear the Calvinists say, well, that God ordains the ends as well as the means, which is just another affirmation of determinism. That means God determines the ends and the means. I mean, everybody on the Calvinistic side believes that. That's exhaustive divine determinism. And fatalists believe that. I mean, even strict, hard deterministic fatalists is all things are determined, the means as well as their ends. Everything's determined. So just saying, God ordains the ends as well as means doesn't answer the objection. It just affirms the reason that the objection is being raised. And so what's the difference between the anti-evangelist and the evangelistic Calvinist? It's not their belief. They both believe God ordains the ends as the means. God determines everything. What's the difference? The difference is God's decreed one of them to evangelize and the other one not to. Right? I mean, the difference is in how they take that belief and play it out in their real world. And if free will is not true, then the reason that the anti-evangelist is choosing to be anti-evangelistic is because ultimately God has decreed for his nature to be such that when he hears Calvinism taught to him and he accepts it, that that natural implication causes him to stop evangelizing and to stop feeling the need to evangelize, because I guess God decreed for him to do that. I mean,
and what is amazing to me, and please, I would love a different answer than this. I would love a better, robust answer than this. But all both Horton and Challies and Phil Johnson do is they use some phrase to just say they went too far in the spectrum. So Charlie says over excessive application. And Horton, I think he says overemphasis, or maybe Phil Johnson says overemphasis. They use some phrase to say excessive application or overemphasis or too much stress in one area. So they say they just swung too far on the pendulum. They just went too far on the spectrum. They need to come back. That is the only thing they say about how the difference between the two, that it's an overemphasis and overstress. That doesn't answer the criticism. That isn't enough. You just can't say, well, they shouldn't go there. That, okay, they shouldn't go there. Great. I'm glad you believe they shouldn't go there. I would call that a blessed inconsistency. That's amazing. I love it. Don't go there yourself. You shouldn't go there either. Great. But that doesn't answer the criticism. I'm not asking, should people do this? I'm asking, is it rational? Isn't it consistent with your theology if they do?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to play a little video clip here so that it's not, you realize it's not just us who talks about this elusive hyper-Calvinist, but actually Calvinists themselves recognize this quandary. And so there's this little video clip that's pretty popular on YouTube. It's popular just, I mean, it has 54,000 views. And it asks the question, what is hyper-Calvinism? And so we're not going to play this whole thing. If you're interested, you can go look that up and find it yourself, because they do give some of their own perspective about this issue in this discussion. But I just want you to hear what he's affirming. The gentleman that's on the screen right there, I think that's David Hall. What he affirms, and he's a Calvinist, by the way, when he says this, and it's kind of an interesting exchange. So let's listen.
Speaking of Calvin, many Calvinists in our day who are actually convinced of their Calvinism are called hyper-Calvinists by their enemies. So tell us, what is hyper-Calvinism, and is it really a danger today?
May I just say that jokingly, before there were blogs, we had a Reformed website in 1994, and we offered a cash prize for the discovery of three things: UFOs, Social Security for a person my age, which now I might actually get, and living, breathing hyper-Calvinist. Because I'm not sure they exist.
I could have won that one because they hate me.
Yeah, but I'm not sure you are one.
No. They hate me.
Right. So there's a difference. Right. There's a difference between the branding we use for our own thoughts and the branding that is stuck upon us, and that is a nice pejorative term to use. A hyper-Calvinist is usually just somebody who is more committed to their Reformed principles than the speaker. But I have honestly never met, in over 60 years of my life, a living, breathing soul who says we should never do evangelism.
I have.
Yeah, I have too. There's some nests of hyper-Calvinists on.
Well, those are not Calvinists. Those are just weird ducks.
You're right. They're not.
Oh, they're weird ducks, but yeah, they're
You're
there.
right. They're not legitimate Calvinists, but
Okay, and so there you got kind of the same quandary that we're bringing up here in their own circle. I thought it was so hilarious that he says, I'm not sure if you are a hyper-Calvinist there, James White, because they're back in that day, back in 2009, 2010. This is actually 2017 video, but back in 2009, 2010, those who followed James White's ministry back in those days, and this is before I even started the podcast, and so I really wasn't a part of all this, but there was this big brouhaha over James White being labeled a hyper-Calvinist because he denies the well-meant offer, meaning that he explains away God's offer or appeal or desire for the salvation of all people. And men like Phil Johnson, the last guy you were just listening to, is a part of the Grace to You ministries with John MacArthur. He wrote an article, a primer on hyper-Calvinism, and that's one of the things he lists, which you may be able to get into a little bit, Eric, because I think you've been going over a little bit of his article. But I think that little video clip kind of captures what we're trying to bring up here, is the elusiveness of how do you define what hyper-Calvinist is. You've got those who are true Calvinists saying, I don't even want to have anything to do with them, don't even put the label Calvinist on them. And it makes it really difficult to really define what this group of people is and if they exist. Yeah,
and that's why it's just a scapegoat. It's a scapegoat to not answer the criticisms that are brought against Reformed theology. And it's amazing to me, and especially Phil Johnson's article, it's amazing to me the distinctions he makes and how he, we joke all the time, we hear all the time that, you don't understand Calvinism. And it makes me think that maybe sometimes also they don't understand non-Calvinism, that they don't actually know what our disagreements with them are. That we say something and then they hear something else and they answer it, well, I don't do that, or that's too far. You shouldn't believe that, or Calvinists shouldn't believe that. And that's great. It just doesn't answer the criticism, even as sometimes they repeat the criticism. They repeat the basis of our criticism, and then they go, oh yeah, but it's not. It's just it's amazing to me how they don't see. But that's where I just want to be like, well, that's exactly what we're talking about, though. And so there's just right at the beginning of the Phil Johnson article, there's several of those. I mean, we can go through it if you want, or if you want to.
Yeah, go ahead and pull up some of the. I mean, whatever you want to kind of go through. I want to thank Joel there for your donation. Appreciate that. Kind of go through a little bit of that with us, because I think Phil, in his article, at least gives us from one Calvinist trying to tell us a definition, because that's what we're saying. We're looking for a definition. And then he wrote this article, and then I think once he realized that it actually included some of his own friends like James White, it's like he began to back off of it. And it's like he was backpedaling. At least that's the way I perceived it anyway. I know I'm biased on that point, but it seems like he defined what hyper-Calvinism is. And then he goes, oh, wait, my definition included one of my buddies. Let me backpedal, and that's what it felt like, at least to me. So yeah,
sure. So what's interesting to me is that there's kind of what I would say is that there's a lack of self-reflection as to what our criticism is. So he begins the article, and he says, and this is called, if you want to look this up, everyone who's listening, this is called a primer on hyper-Calvinism. And it's still up there on the internet, even though maybe he's backed off of it a little bit. He left it up. And he says this. He says, virtually every revival of true Calvinism since the Puritan era has been hijacked, crippled, or ultimately killed by hyper-Calvinist influences. So he's saying virtually every revival of true Calvinism has been killed by hyper-Calvinist influences.
By God's decree.
Sure, by God's decree.
Okay, sorry, I have to keep putting that in there just because it just makes
right. And he's kicking against he's kicking against the goads, right? Who are you to answer back to God? He's answering back to God.
Yeah, for some reason, God has ordained for hyper-Calvinists to slip into Calvinism to make it die back out, and so we have to ask why.
We'll answer back. We'll let him answer back to God, and we'll answer back to him, and we'll say, and I'll ask, could it be? And I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this, because this seems to me how things go outside of theology too, is that could it be that the tendency of systems of thought is to become more extreme in subsequent generations as those generations make it their own, right? So let's think of like the Democratic Party, right? The Democratic Party of Bill Clinton, I'm old enough to remember the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton. I remember Bill in the 90s. That party is gone. Like that party doesn't exist. And that's because the children of that Democratic Party have taken it over and they have moved it farther left. And that young people just in general, and if you like you see the surveys on this, you pay attention to this stuff, young people in general are just like okay with communism. And I think it isn't because they know what communism is or they're actually okay with it. I think there are some,
or at least socialism. Yeah.
Socialism, right? Yeah, they're okay. They're just fine with it. And I think the reason for that is because young people want like some sense of belonging, right? Young people want something to belong to and something to fight, and there's something wrong, and they have all this energy, and they want to make a difference in their lives, and they want to make their lives matter, and they give themselves over to something greater than themselves. And so the move left has been driven by young people who want this utopia, right? That socialism gives you a utopia to fight for. And that is really intoxicating if you're a young person. So the development of thought has been, it's gone more extreme. Take abortion, for example, right? In the 90s or 80s, 90s, abortion was safe, legal, and rare. Oh, we need it to be legal, but we also kind of acknowledge it's not the best thing, so safe, legal, and rare. Now it's shout your abortion. Right? You have female celebrities on stage going, killing my baby was the best thing that I could ever possibly have done. And so now it's gone so much more extreme. Okay, so I say that parallel too, and this is where I say this parallel to compare it to Reformed theology, where, as you know, Reformed theology, the resurgent, the young, restless, and reformed. I mean, the book is literally called "Young, Restless, and Reformed." Restless right. Came out of their easy believism parents. Their parents went to these easy believism churches, and they were searching for some meaning, something to belong to. And Reformed theology came around and did a great job. There were great guys like Piper, and who captured this sort of spirit and transformed it into this young, restless, and reformed movement. Could it be that the children of these people, the children of these guys, are going to want to take it and go farther with it to make it their own, as these things tend to happen?
Yeah, and one example of a well-known individuals that happened with is R.C. Sproul and R.C. Sproul Jr.,
exactly.
Where you have R.C. Sproul Sr., who is a little bit more balanced. He's a classical approach, apologetics. You have him being very careful with not calling God the author, creator of sin, those kinds of things. And then you've got R.C. Sproul Jr., who takes more of a presuppositional approach and says things really provocatively like God creates sin, and just doesn't want to back off of it because he's more consistent within his theological grid of Calvinism than his dad was, but possibly and arguably less consistent with what the Scripture actually reveals, because the system itself becomes very much kind of the driving force, and you become, like you said, once you become a part of a movement and a brotherhood of others, then you get a lot of backslaps and the attaboys. It's easier to feel to feel like you can push the envelope a little further.
Right. Once you have R.C. Sproul saying no rogue molecule, you kind of it's natural. You may think they shouldn't. You may think they ought not. But it is natural for the subsequent generation to take the no rogue molecule idea and go, why don't we just go farther with it? If this is where our parents were and we want to be separate from our parents, we want to make this thing our own, well, what does no rogue molecule actually mean? And they take it farther. Could that be why?
Yeah.
Because Calvinism logically ends there, that the subsequent generations, the children of the movement, tend to go there.
Thomas Richards on the side chat made a comment that really, this is good, Thomas. This is the kind of stuff I'm looking for. He says, interestingly, the Hyper-Calvinists cite some of the same scriptures about the hardening as provisionists do to prove judicial hardening. Both recognize the logical inconsistencies of the popular forms of Calvinism in regard to evangelism and the well-meant offer in regards to these scriptures. The Hyper-Calvinist goes further into Calvinism beyond Calvin, and the provisionist goes away from Calvinism. This is a great point, because this is why on my dissertation, I won't say who this was, but you would recognize his name because he's a pretty well-known guy in the Southern Baptist world who's written books on the subject. He was my reader, one of my readers, one of 5 of my readers for my dissertation. And he really pushed me on my view of judicial hardening, because he says, well, Leighton, you sound like the Calvinist here. Because you sound like God is actively blinding people by using parabolic languages and these kinds of things, and that's what the Hyper-Calvinists say, and you can't say that. And I had to tell him, I said, Dr. So-and-so, listen, this is I think the Scripture does say that God hardens people, but He doesn't do it arbitrarily, or He doesn't do it for no apparent reason before they're ever born because He doesn't love them or something of that nature. No, this is an act of a judge who is striving to bring about his plan through the redemption of these people who do rebel. And so he's doing this for a good purpose, and it's actually for their good. It's actually for the purpose of them stumbling but not beyond recovery. They may be provoked to envy so that they too may be saved. So it's not under certain condemnation. And once I explained it to him, he goes, well, yeah, I can kind of see where you're coming from. Okay. But he still was very uncomfortable with the concept or idea of God actively hardening. But those verses are used by the Hyper-Calvinists to say, look, here is God actively reprobating people, the non-elect. This is God. This is God saying, I don't want these people to be saved. I've never wanted them to be saved. And so the way the provisionists like myself take these same verses out of, Romans 11 and John 12 and about 15 other places about the hardening of Israel. Those are the verses that we use to explain how and why God would cut somebody off in their unbelief and blind them with parables and those kinds of things so as to bring about his purposes, like the sting operation with police officers and those kinds of things that we talk about. From our perspective, those are so vital to understand the strategy of God. But from the Calvinist perspective, if you're going to use those verses, you can't be a moderate Calvinist and still take those verses into consideration. You've got to explain them away or ignore them. And that's exactly what I think Thomas is pointing out here, is that the Hyper-Calvinist uses those same verses to support their hyperism, that God is actively out there reprobating, hiding people from the gospel because he really doesn't love them and doesn't want them. And I think that's a great parallel.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, what I would love our Reformed brothers to ask themselves is, as Phil Johnson says, virtually every single time Calvinism comes back and then dies off and is killed by Hyper-Calvinism, why is that? Now, here's another example of that. He says that Hyper-Calvinism, in this same article, Johnson says that Hyper-Calvinism is in the practice of acutely minimizing the moral and spiritual responsibility of sinners. So acutely minimizing the moral and spiritual responsibility of sinners. Maybe, I would love this question to be considered and answered, maybe Calvinism becomes Hyper-Calvinism virtually every time because Calvinism implicitly minimizes the moral and spiritual responsibility of sinners, and Hyper-Calvinism simply takes what is implicit and makes it explicit or acute, as Johnson defines it. So
that's very interesting.
He says acutely, but as long as you do it like on the low, you're still a historic Calvinist.
Yeah, because that's been my biggest complaint against Calvinism, is that they remove the blameworthiness of man, because ultimately you've got people hating God because he first hated them. And then, of course, you've got somebody like a Michael Horton, a more moderate kind of Calvinist, going, no, that's not what we would say. We wouldn't say they're hating God because God first hated them. We would believe that God has a general love for all of people. So that's not really true. But then you start pressing them and you go, okay, wait, you believe in total inability, right? And Michael Horton would say, yes, of course, all people are born unable to want to follow God or to believe in the truth unless they've been regenerated first. He would affirm that. You believe in unconditional election, right? Well, yes, before the foundation of the world, God did choose them before the foundation of the world. And you believe in irresistible grace, right? I mean, you believe that God regenerates the person he's chosen and brings them to life so that they'll believe. Oh, yeah, we'll believe that. Okay, so what's the implications of all of those three affirmations? That a person is born unchosen by God, born without the ability to believe the gospel for reasons beyond his control, unless he's given an irresistible grace. So how are you avoiding that charge? There's no logical way for you to avoid the charge that you're making people unblameworthy. I mean, you're taking away the blameworthiness of the sinner, because you're ultimately having them reject the God who first rejected them, rejecting a provision that was never made for them, if limited atonement is true. And I don't know how they can get away with that, honestly.
And they don't. And what's so fascinating about this, my reading so far, is that they don't try. They don't try to logically get away from it. They just try to rhetorically get away from it. You ought not to say it like this. You ought not to take it this far. You ought to stay on this side of the spectrum. And that's great, but that doesn't prevent it. And it doesn't,
Right. Well, I was going to say believe like a Calvinist, but preach like an Arminian, as the old saying goes. That's that kind of mentality of practically speaking, you need to live like free will is true, but theologically speaking, we know it's not. It just seems to go that way. And Benjamin points out there, if total inability is true, wouldn't God need to actively reprobate people? You wouldn't God wouldn't need to actively reprobate people. You just need to leave them alone. And that's what we've talked about before is why put a blindfold on a corpse? If a man is born dead spiritually in the way the Calvinists say he is, then there's no reason speaking in parabolic language, sending a spirit of stupor, and all the other hardening text, because that person's already hardened. What do you have to harden? I mean, how does a dead heart grow more hardened? It's already dead. And so, yeah, Benjamin's pointing out, I think, one of the logical fallacies of that perspective. What are some other things that you found in your readings with maybe go back to Phil Johnson's article, or maybe some of the things that marks of a hyper-Calvinist, if you will, that would help us to say, okay, here's the things that good Calvinists, when I say good Calvinists, I mean evangelistic Calvinists, are telling their Calvinistic following, don't go this way, don't go too far here, because that's the Badlands, so to speak. Talk through that.
Right. So he has, like, right at the beginning, he has in his article, he has like three kind of main points, the three main definitions of hyper-Calvinists. And the first one is that hyper-Calvinists tend to stress, and we mentioned this kind of earlier, but I would, love to display what I think is this conundrum that Johnson doesn't answer. He says it correctly points out that hyper-Calvinists tend to stress the secret or decorative will of God over his revealed or perceptive will. So they stress the secret will over the revealed will. And see what I mean? He's not trying to make a distinction with the difference between historic Calvinism and hyper-Calvinism. He's not trying to show how hyper-Calvinism gets historical Calvinism objectively, rationally incorrect. He's saying that Calvinism is just a spectrum, and hyper-Calvinism goes too far in one direction. They just stress it too much. And here's my question for you. And so I'm kind of reading in between the lines here a little bit. I'm reading into this a little bit, and you tell me if I'm off base here. But if I can read here between the lines here a little bit, it seems to me that Johnson is implicitly admitting the logical conundrum between God's secret will and revealed will, wherein God commands you don't sin, but then secretly decrees that you will sin. Right? He seems to admit that that is a logical condition that exists, and is just saying, don't try to square that circle because you might become a hyper-Calvinist. Am I off there?
No, I mean, that's exactly what the video we played, 2 or 3 years ago, when Piper was asked that question. He was saying it's better on this question to be more biblical than Calvinist. we jumped all over that, of course, because he seemed to be insinuating that it's not biblical to be a Calvinist. And obviously he wouldn't say that as a 7-point Calvinist that he is. But what he was trying to get to was, it's better to don't let the logical implications of your Calvinism to take you that direction, is what it seems to be trying to argue, because he recognizes that, it's the very first question that people ask when you're introduced to Tulip. It's the first question I asked when I was introduced to Tulip. It's the first question 95% of people asked me when I was recruiting them into the Tulip bandwagon back when I was a Calvinist. Well, why do we evangelize? Why witness? Why would we do that? Why does the brain go there? The brain goes there because the implication is, well, if God's already picked who he's going to save, and he is irresistibly, effectually going to bring them to salvation, regardless of my activity in the matter, then why do I even need to be active in the matter? And then the answer to that is because, well, God commanded you to, and therefore now your motivation is not love, it's law. And that becomes a problem, because the Bible seems to indicate that love is supposed to be our motivator for evangelism, because that's the motivation for the cross. And so you have people now being motivated out of obligation and law versus out of actual love for and a desire for appeal to be made, because it's through that appeal that's being made. And that seems to be the mark of what I see from more of a hyper tendency, is to kind of downplay the offer or the appeal aspect of Calvinism, to where, or excuse me, of Christianity in general. Like, yeah, we're supposed to preach to everybody because we don't know who the elect are, but it's not really an offer here. It's not really an appeal, as 1 Corinthians calls it, and as Paul calls it in 1 Corinthians 5:20. that Christ is in us, making his appeal, be reconciled to God. It's not really an appeal, because God doesn't make appeals, because that makes God weak, as he's just namby-pamby asking for people to do stuff. And that just makes God into this weak, namby-pamby God. And so God doesn't make appeals. God commands, and he brings what he commands out. If he wants it to happen, he'll make it happen, by golly. And that seems to me to be kind of the mark or the central theme of what is tending towards hyperism.
Right. And I think that people ask that question. It's always the first question, like taking it a level deeper. I think that people ask that first question because we intuitively know that our actions make a difference. We just know. It is intuitively true. It is axiomatically true in our lives that what we do matters and makes a difference. We know that is true. And so when someone comes around and tells us, well, that's not exactly true, in order to make that, in order for us to process that in our brains, they have to create these two categories where it's, no, it really does kind of matter in some way, but then there's a secret way in which it doesn't matter. See? Oh yeah, okay. And so I think that's why people ask the question. But and in one of my articles, I ask this question too. And this is, again, one of those criticisms that I would love to hear an answer to, okay? And it starts with a premise, and then it asks a question, and you can, tell me my question is wrong, you can tell me my premise is wrong, but here's the question here. This is the premise. If which individual God saves and who he does not save is up to him and him alone, okay, is that true on Calvinism? Yes. Seems to me, yeah, right? Has to be, right? Yeah. Will this effectual salvation be hindered by any lack of evangelism on our individual parts? Right. So if I individually decide not to evangelize, will his effectual salvation, which is up to him and him alone, be affected at all? If God is sovereign and God always gets what he wants, that can't be true, right? Will it? So then the other side, flip the coin. Will it be affected by heaps of heaps of evangelism on our parts? No. Those people will be saved whether we heap evangelism on it or don't evangelize at all. So if that is all true, it would be perfectly rational and correct for me subjectively to decide I'm never going to evangelize. And I can be fully confident that if Reformed theology is true, God's elect will still be saved.
Right, and that's the pushback I would always give, because they would always say, well, God ordains the ends as well as the means, and I would say, well, then if my decision is not to get involved, then that means he did not ordain me to be the means, right? And so I can justify
individually, right? Exactly.
Individually. In other words, you may say, okay, somebody has to evangelize that elect person, but it doesn't have to be me, because somebody's going to evangelize that person regardless of my involvement. And so instead of you having an actual impact on whether people hear, you can actually use that as an excuse. Now, I'm maybe Calvinists would or not admit this, but I've actually heard some Calvinists admit this in broadcasts before, who were intellectually honest enough to say they have allowed their view of soteriology to cause them to pass on an evangelism opportunity. Because of the difficulty, and then the thought in their brain, well, God's sovereign. It didn't work out this time, and I just don't really feel up to it.
Ideas have consequences.
Yeah,
ideas have consequences.
Yeah, and so I've heard actually, and this happened to me a few times throughout my Calvinist time, where I specifically remember where I was sitting when I really felt I need to go talk to that guy. I really feel like God's put that person on my heart. And there was some distractions and some things. Well, I've got this test thing I've got to go study for. And I remember contemplating to myself, should I go talk to this guy later? You know what? If it's ordained, God's going to give me an opportunity. God's going to give me an opportunity. I'm not going to do it right now. And I never did get an opportunity to talk to the guy, but I'm just thinking to myself, if I wasn't a Calvinist, in other words, if Calvinism hadn't been taught to me at that point, and I had that feeling like I had in that library to go talk to that guy, if I didn't have that thought in my brain, hey, if God's ordained it, then he'll give me another opportunity, If I didn't have that, would I have said, you know what, I'm going to take this opportunity because that guy's life could depend upon me speaking the truth. I mean, I need to be willing to engage here. And so those are the kinds of that's just a little, obviously a little anecdotal kind of thing that happened to me with one experience. And I'm not trying to say it always happens that way or all Calvinists ignore that, voice telling them to go talk to somebody. I'm just saying, couldn't that be happening all over the place at different places and times in people's life, where their view of soteriology is causing a lack, if nothing else, at least a lack of urgency about spreading the good news, or this concept of I have a role to play here.
And I don't think this leads exactly into the next thing that Johnson says in this article. I don't think that when they go looking for these answers, or they see this in themselves, this lack of desire to evangelize, and they see this happening and they go looking for answers, I don't think it's helpful enough. I don't think it answers the question. I don't think it gives them that impetus back for their the highest Reformed thinkers, theologians, to just say, well, you ought not, you ought to. I don't think that's enough. I don't think that answers it. And this is basically what Johnson says here in the next part. He says, this is the second thing he says that Hyper-Calvinism is defined as, and this goes to that question of, why do I need to evangelize? Like, just a subjective, what happens if I don't or do talk to this person? He says that he defines Hyper-Calvinism as, it is a denial that the gospel message includes any sincere proposal of divine mercy to sinners in general. So Hyper-Calvinism is a denial that the gospel message includes any sincere proposal of divine mercy to sinners in general. So my question is, what does the word sincere mean?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because how can a Calvinist, even the modified form like Michael Horton or Phil Johnson or whoever else you might want to put in that category, I don't know who would be in that category either necessarily, but how would you say it's sincere for God to not choose somebody before the foundation of the world, and actually to choose for to be the Esau? I've hated them salvifically if they're going to interpret Romans 9 that way, than to say, okay, but there is a way in which he sincerely is making an offer to them. This is kind of the history of the debate, by the way, for those that aren't aware of why this has been debated even among Calvinists. There's a big debate among Calvinists back in the 20s and before, 1920s, 30s and before. There was this, the Princeton theologians and many others that are more who affirm universal extent of the atonement and those kinds of things. And you can see some of this in David Allen's book. But the big part of the issue is, in order to make a genuine bona fide offer of something to somebody, it has to be there for them. And the illustration I've always used with my 4 kids is, as I've said, okay, I've got 4 children. I walk in with 3 presents I've purchased for them. But I just know that my youngest is the type of kid that wouldn't ever do what I'm going to ask him to do. So I know I really don't need it for him. So I just buy the 3 presents and I hold them behind my back and I walk in and I say, if all of you will come give me a hug, if whoever gives me a hug, I will give you a present. And of course, the 3 oldest come and give me a hug, because I know that that's the kind of persons they are. And I know that, of course, the youngest one's on, PlayStation or whatever else, and he doesn't come. Okay. And I didn't purchase the gift. Well, even the offer itself is disingenuous, because I have said, if you do this, I will give you a present. I didn't buy a present for that child. So I've just made a disingenuous offer, regardless of my knowledge of what that kid would do. I have just offered him something I never purchased for him. And this was a big debate back in the day, is that if you're going to offer somebody, if you're sending the gospel to all creatures, like the Bible says to do, then there has to be a provision for them. And if there's not a provision for them, you can't make the offer. Otherwise, you're sending out messengers to lie for you. Hey, God loves you. He wants you to believe in him. He's provided this for you. Nope, not for most of you. He hadn't. that's where the problem becomes. And that's why there's this debate, even among Reformed theologians, on the extent of the atonement versus the application and all those kinds of issues that come along with this, because it really does get to the point of the genuineness, or like you said, the sincerity of God's provision and love for people.
So then the difference between a Calvinist and a Hyper-Calvinist isn't the actual doctrine. It's as couched in limited atonement. It is how you say it. So again, part of my original thesis was they're using this terminology of Hyper-Calvinism for language control, to control the language of the debate. So what Johnson is saying here is that as long as you don't explicitly deny the gospel message is sincere, then you're a Calvinist. But every Calvinist can go on to, and of course, in our view, this is what they're doing. They can go on to implicitly deny the gospel message is sincere, and that gets Phil Johnson's stamp of approval. It's amazing to me. I see most of, if not all, the messages that you receive on social media, and I see a lot of the things that are going on, the people that are like pushing back against you. And a question I have asked before, and I would love to ask people haven't answered and have people actually reflect on this question is, why do you think that we are arguing against Calvinism? Do you think it's because we're bored and we need something to do, and it's just this thing that we don't like it and we're emotional about it, and it's just, it's us versus them and we love the us versus them and we just love to argue? What is it that you think that we're doing here? Could it be that we believe that Calvinism decreases the sincerity of the gospel? And can you objectively step outside just for a second, and can you admit that if that's true, that's kind of a big deal? That it's kind of a big deal if there's a system of theology out there that makes the gospel message insincere. You don't think it does. That's fine, but consider for a second. I do. I think that it does. I see Calvinism as making the gospel offer insincere. Could it be that that's why I spend time doing this? Could it be? Okay, so now you have to deal with me as sincere. Now you have to deal with me as sincerely seeing a rational theological problem within Reformed theology. And now you need to answer that problem that I have. I sincerely see this issue. You need to address this issue. You need to address the sincerity of the gospel on Calvinism in a theological and rational way. And I don't see people doing that. I don't see it from the top. I'm not talking about on social media or your average church-going guy. From the top, I don't see them addressing this criticism of the sincerity of the gospel, even as Johnson seems to think that that's a big deal. Johnson seems to say, hey, it's wrong not to think the gospel is sincere. Exactly. It's wrong to think that the gospel isn't sincere.
And if you have a theology that makes you have to warn people away from thinking that the gospel is sincere, maybe you should question the theology.
Go one more step. He goes and Horton does the same thing in the article that I wrote. He goes and he skirts around and he says it, and then doesn't take another logical leap down that road. He steps in it and he puts one foot forward and he says the criticism. He says it out loud. He asks the question, does this mean that the gospel is insincere? In other words, that's what he asks. And it's okay, go one more, just take another logical step, and then we're going to get somewhere in our discussion. But they don't do it. They just control the language and say, as long as you claim that it's sincere, you're a historic Calvinist.
Right. And then that becomes a question. And I think this is why, the guys who do argue against the well-meant offer, they're trying to say, okay, it just seems logically inconsistent for us to say God sincerely desires for the salvation of non-elect people. And so they're going ahead and swallowing the difficult pill and just saying, as A.W. Pink says, God really doesn't love everybody, and God doesn't really want everybody to be saved. And according to Phil Johnson's definition, it seems that those are hypers, though maybe if you pressed him in person, he would back off of it because friends of his fit that description now, and he doesn't want to do that. I don't know, but yeah, that's where I think the real tension is when it comes to this issue of hyper-Calvinism, because you've got folks who are denying the well-meant offer, meaning God doesn't really love or desire the salvation of a large number of people in our world. And that does seem to be consistent with the claims of the tulip systematic.
Right, and what I see all the time is I see this kind of pious sounding speech, and Prime would call it sanctimonious blather. He's got like that great term, sanctimonious blather, right? Where you say this thing that sounds pious, but if you take it a step farther, it actually makes God the author of evil. So salvation is all of God. And we could say the same thing. We would mean something totally different. We could say the same thing. But salvation is all of God. And so if you give any choice to human beings at all, that takes away the glory of God or whatever. And you have this pious sounding sanctimonious blather that goes on with this issue. And again, it's more language control. It's more how does it sound. But if you say that salvation is all of God, okay, let's take that one. It's not a logical leap. It's not a conspiracy theory. I don't need the crazy wall with all the pictures and the, pish pins with the strings attached. I don't need the whole thing. It's just one little logical leap forward, and that means that God has decided that the vast majority of humanity from all eternity past will burn in hell without any chance of recovery whatsoever. And it's like, It sounds pious to say the other thing, but then the logical end of it is doesn't protect the holiness of God. It doesn't protect the well-meant offer of the gospel. And so let's discuss this. Okay, fine, you can say that, but let's discuss this other thing over here. And so often it only stays in the how it sounds, the pious soundingness of it.
I think you're right on there. Peter has a good definition of a hyper-Calvinist, one who is causally determined to drink too much coffee.
Okay, listen, I feel attacked. Okay, it's quarantine. I've got nothing else to look forward to in my day except my second or third cup of coffee. I feel personally attacked by that, Peter. I don't appreciate it.
Because we're hyper-provisionists right now.
I got one more.
Okay, go ahead for it.
I'm kind of good. All right. So this is the third mark of the hyper-Calvinist, and this one is amazing to me. This one's amazing to me, and I know that you kind of personally relate to this one, and so maybe I'm setting you up here a little bit. Okay, so he says third, mark the fact that hyper-Calvinism encourages introspection in the search to know whether or not one is elect. So then he says that. So that's kind of a quote that he's quoting. That Hyper-Calvinism encouraged introspection in the search to know whether one is elect or not. So then he says, it goes on to say, assurance tends to be elusive for people under the influence of Hyper-Calvinist teaching. So first, I want to say that I'm so glad that most Reformed churches are not, as he goes on to say in this article, barren, inert, militant, or elitist. I'm so glad most churches aren't like that. I'm so glad most Calvinists have assurance of their salvation. I'm so glad of those things. And Phil Johnson goes on to warn them that they will become like that if they go down this Hyper-Calvinist route. That's right. I'm glad he says that. And I'm so glad that we're not in a place where a lot of Reformed churches are like that. However, the phrase assurance tends to be elusive is fascinating to me, because on Calvinism, in whose mind is contained the decision for salvation? In whose mind? God's. God decides from eternity past which individuals will be saved. So the decision for which individual will be saved is in the mind of God. We cannot know the mind of God. We cannot know the decisions he has made. Whether or not we are saved, whether or not we are counted on the elect, is couched in his mind. I can't know that. I fundamentally cannot know that. So how does anyone have assurance if that theology is true?
Yeah, especially if God has ordained for you to think you're saved when you're not. In other words, if God wants you to think you're saved, the effervescent grace that Calvin speaks of, or others, you speak of people who have a faith that is a temporary type of faith or something of that nature, or even somebody like in Matthew where he says, they cry out to me, Lord, Lord, but do not enter the kingdom of heaven. That person on Calvinism was ordained by God to believe. They truly were in relationship with God. They truly had salvation. And he says, depart from me, I never knew you. On Calvinism, God ordained them to believe that they were saved when they weren't. And therefore, how can you possibly know you're not one of those people? It would be impossible. And some guys, and I've heard some Calvinists say, well, I would know because I know, because I believe this. I said, well, of course you would say that because God's ordained for you to believe that you're really of his. How could you possibly know that in 6 months from now, he hasn't ordained for you to deny the faith and become an atheist and begin to do all kinds of strange things? You have no control over where you're going from this point forward. God has ordained your faith, and therefore maybe your abandonment of it later.
And I hope Calvinists don't go there, but it seems to me that they do. And I know you've had personal experience with this. I've had personal experience with this, with personal friends of mine who have adopted a somewhat reformed view of theology, and they go on to have just crippling doubts about their own sinfulness, that they are stuck in their sin, these things that they keep doing, these problems that they're having, they're completely stuck in them, and they despair. They despair about their position before God because they can't know it. And they despair of their position in sanctification and spiritual growth because they feel like they can't do anything differently because their theology tells them they can't do anything. So I hope that Reformed people don't go in this run and they have a blessed inconsistency. But Phil Johnson just saying, hey, don't go there, isn't enough. We need to have a robust conversation, and we need to have robust answers to how it is that Reformed people can have assurance when their election is couched in the mind of God, when what is going to happen in their life, their spiritual growth is couched in the decree of God. How can you give people assurance and hope when these things are true? I don't see these robust answers within Reformed theology. And so I have to shout at them from the outside. You guys need to answer these questions, because I know people, and I'm sure so many people know people who are despairing in these things.
Well, yeah, I get messages, as you well know, Eric, you see some of them from people all over the world who are despairing, some people in the side chat over here, even now, about not knowing whether they're truly loved of God or if they may have been reprobated because they struggle with doubt and those kinds of things. I remember going through a period of that when I was a Calvinist too, because I was dealing with some secret sin in my life. And so my first thought was, well, maybe I'm not elect, because an elect person wouldn't probably deal with this secret sin, until I got some counsel from a Calvinist friend of mine who said, well, the fact that you're battling, the fact that you desire to get rid of the sin proves that God's working in you, and therefore you must be elect. That must be a sign of the Spirit in you. So you're one of the elect. So then I stopped thinking, okay, well, I'm not a reprobate, but then why has God ordained for me to have these desires? And therefore I think the only way I could get out of my sin and my addiction was to say, well, God, take away that desire. Versus understanding God does love me. He has already provided me everything I need to remove sin from my life. But the first thing you've got to do is own your sin as yours, not mine. It's not something I'm ordaining for you to do, Leighton. This is something I don't want you to do. And you have every ability to stop doing this. But how do you do that? Through what the Scripture says. Well, confess your sin, bring it into the light, get help, get counsel, get guidance, get accountability, all the things that we need to do.
And one thing that helped me to get to the place where I could do those things, get help, get counsel, have a better discipline with spiritual disciplines and things like that, was the theology, the knowledge that God didn't want that for me in any sense. There is no secret will. There is no sense in which God wants me to sin or God wants me to be stuck in these destructive patterns. He doesn't want that for me at all. He didn't orchestrate the circumstances in my life for that to happen. He didn't, put these things in place and make it so that I couldn't do any differently. He had nothing to do with it. It was other people who sinned against me, and then my own penchant for sins and my own human weakness. He had nothing to do with that. All he wants is good things for me. There is no sense in which God wants these evil, destructive things for me. And once that took a while for me to actually believe that. But once I did, it was so freeing and hopeful and all of these things that I don't think Calvinism can consistently provide that sort of that hope and that counsel to people.
Yeah. And some of the things that we're talking about, keep in mind that there is, for some Calvinists at least, there is maybe a cognitive dissonance between some of the claims of the system itself and the outplay of how that system
blessedly so.
Yes, blessedly so. And they would,
Absolutely.
and some of them would probably say the same thing about us on other issues.
Sure.
And so we're acknowledging that if you're tuning in here and you're watching this and you're going, "Oh, I know Calvinists, and that's not the way they are at all." And I've been a Calvinist for this many years, and I've not once even thought about not evangelizing somebody, or I've never once thought that my addiction or my sin was because of a decree of God or whatever it may be. Don't hear me saying that because my experience was this, or because there's some anecdotal story about something happening within somebody's life like that it's true across the board. It may not be. And it's not always the case. But the fact that it is the case with some, or even a good number of people, is enough reason for it to be addressed. And like I think, Eric, you said so eloquently before, when we're doing this, I was on Twitter not long ago, which I don't recommend really.
For real.
It's just not worth it. But I was on Twitter the other day, and I was posting something about the back and forth with Ken Wilson and everything, and all the different stuff that's going on with that. And this one guy just kind of rebuked me.
I haven't heard about any of that. Could you please?
No.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Just shut up. Just shut up. Just have to. I'm sorry, y'all had to see that side of me. I had to get Eric back in his place there for a second. Y'all never had me tell somebody to shut up, have you? Okay. Anyway, I posted something, and this guy says, "Are you on a campaign or something?" And he was rebuking me making this. And I said, "Yeah, I'm on a campaign. I'm a campaign to make the love of God known for all people." And this is what you were talking about, is the reason that we're making a big deal of this is because we do believe it's a big deal for the genuineness and sincerity of the gospel appeal to all people, the sincerity of God's love and provision for all people, that it's not just a fake offer, a faux offer, if you will. It's not just pretending like I want this for everybody, but really I only have my select few, my elite, that I have set aside for this. We also want to, believe it or not, maintain the blameworthiness of those who reject him. And I think Calvinism, if the implications of Calvinism, if nothing else, strongly undermine the blameworthiness of the unbeliever, because they are an unbeliever not by choice. They're an unbeliever by nature, meaning that's the way God made them. God decreed for them to be an unbeliever, and they could not have done otherwise. I can't think of a better excuse in the world for unbelievers than Calvinism gives them. It's almost like the article I put online about, okay, what if we judged everybody with blue eyes? Do you have blue eyes, by the way, Eric? I can't tell on the camera.
You're like greenish hazily.
Okay. Me too. I'm the same way. We're I guess green hazel eyes. Okay, so the green hazel eyes are the elect people. Okay, but if you have blue eyes or brown eyes or some other non-hazel eyes, then sorry, you're out. And we treat you badly, or we mistreat you as us hazel eyes better people than you are. Everybody would find that ridiculous. Why? Because you have no control ultimately over the color of your eyes. Well, that's one of the reasons we hate bigotry for racism.
Yeah, that's why bigotry is so ridiculous.
Right, yeah, because you're judging somebody not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin or their eyes or their hair or their lack of hair or whatever it is that they don't have any control over. Okay, so what more control does the reprobate have over his nature than does a man have over the color of their eyes or skin on Calvinism? You tell me. I mean, if you can give me a clear distinction with how it is that humanity has any real sense of control over the content of their character, then on Calvinism, then I would love to hear it, because I've not heard a rational explanation as to how humanity really has any control over the content of their character. They are God haters from birth, idol factories, vipers in diapers, doomed from the womb, according to Calvin. Those are quotes from Calvinists, by the way. That's not just me saying it. Their skin color is determined from birth as much as their nature to hate God is determined from birth, and they have no control over that. To me, that removes the blameworthiness of the sinner. And so the reason we're making such a strong appeal against Calvinism is not because we just hate Calvinists and we just don't have anything better to do and that we're just trying to be mean and we're just angry with everybody. No, we're talking about the genuineness of the gospel, the genuineness, sincerity of God's love for all people, the glory of God as a God of love, that the sacrifice of Christ was made for all people, that he genuinely wants all people to be saved. He's not tricking some people into thinking they're saved when they're really not. All of those kinds of things that really make the Bible seem duplicitous in a lot of ways. And we're trying to also maintain, believe it or not, the blameworthiness of the sinner, that the sinner recognizes that when you reject God, when you reject the clear offer of the gospel, you're to blame for that. You can't do what Derek Webb does as the atheist now who used to be a Calvinist, writing songs in favor of Calvinism, even with Caedmon's Call back in the day, who says things like, well, it's really not up to me. I'm in the grave next to Lazarus, he said, and if God wants me, he'll call me out of the grave, and I'm open for it. If he wants me, then he'll call me out of the grave. But really, I have no control over that.
And I think one of the problems there in reaching the ears when we say these things like that, reaching the ears of our Reformed brothers and sisters, is that they only hear that from us. They only hear that is Calvinism from people like us who are criticizing Calvinism. They don't hear that is included in Reformed theology from their Reformed pastors. There's in the comments, I don't think I can't interact with these comments, but Paul Barnes at 323, a little bit farther up, makes a really good point. And I think it's worth taking 2 minutes to address here, is that he says, and he's right in this, he says, in my experience, most Calvinists, it's a different one. Most Calvinist preachers seldom, if ever, refer to God's alleged meticulous determinism. It is not in the forefront of their mind when they preach. So the two aspects of there, that is, yes, that is an accurate description. They don't. And so the question we could go into, well, it's still true on Calvinism because here's these Calvinistic sources and whatever. That's not really going to move people's minds. They don't hear it from their Reformed pastors. So that creates a difficulty for us because they're only hearing about meticulous determinism from Reformed theology's critics. And so it's easy to dismiss it as not actual Reformed theology. But what I would say, the other thing that I would say about that is, why is that? Why isn't meticulous determinism the forefront of their mind when they preach? Why isn't it there? And I agree it's not. It's not there because living that out is untenable. You can't actually live and preach as if meticulous determinism was true. Try apologizing to your wife if meticulous determinism was true. You know what, babe? I feel bad that you were determined to feel bad about the thing I was determined to do that I couldn't do differently. It's a bummer situation we're in, but you know what? There's nothing I could have done. Would anyone's wife accept that as an apology?
Well, if anybody is a kid or teenager here, maybe listening in, and your parents are Calvinist, man, this is the best thing for you. I mean, you could just, you sneak out one night, you steal your dad's car or whatever, and he brings you home and he says, "Son, what were you thinking? Why did you do that?" God ordained it, Dad. I really
would your dad take that as an apology? No, he would say, "Son, you're not taking responsibility for your actions." That's right, because you do know intuitively, you know in your heart that you have responsibility for your actions. You know that the terrible thing you said to your wife, you could have done differently. You know it in your bones, even if your theology tells you otherwise. And so they don't preach like that. They don't have relationships. Thank God they don't have relationships with their wives like that. They don't teach their kids that. They behave as if their actions mean that they could have done differently, that their actions matter, that they are morally responsible. They just know that's true, and they preach and they live that way. Thankfully, we're just saying, hey, look, your theology contradicts that.
Okay, but let me defend the Calvinist here against Eric, the hyper provisionist that you are, drinking all your hyper coffee over there.
It's water though. I need to have a coffee button. It's like the coffee. I need to. All right.
Yeah, I'm sure your wife would just jump on that, would she?
She doesn't have anything else.
Well, let's say, Stephen and I are going to be the Calvinist, and Stephen needs a good representative, and so I'm going to be the Calvinist. And the difference between you, Eric, and the person who ends up in hell is that you made a wiser decision. And because you made a wiser decision, you can boast in that decision. And so it sounds like to me, you're trying to take credit for your salvation. And who are you to take credit for God's grace and his salvation? I mean, you're obviously one of those kinds of guys that likes to go around and roll down your window and shout at the door, I saved myself because of my wise decisions. And I am awesome. And you probably have a banner on the back of your car saying, look at me, how awesome I am. I saved myself.
Sure.
Obviously, because I mean, that's what you as a provisionist do. It's pretty clear that that's probably what you're doing. And you're just a boastaholic. Just admit it. You're a boastaholic. You're trying to steal glory from God and take it to yourself. And when you get to heaven and God stands before you at the judgment, and he says, why should I let you into heaven? You're going to say, well, because I earned it, because I'm a really wise decision maker. And so let me in right now, or I will knock you down. I mean, is that pretty much describe provisionism?
I take a different, I've heard your answer to this question. I take a different tact on this, and I just go, yeah, it was a wiser decision. Yep. Okay. It was a wiser, and this isn't controversial at all. And it also doesn't earn me my salvation. It isn't controversial at all to say that waiting for the crosswalk to go green is a wiser decision than running across the street and just hoping you don't get hit. Like, there are just wiser decisions in the world, and it's not boasting to say that you made a wiser decision. It's not controversial at all to say that some decisions are unwise and other decisions are wise. You do that, Stephen, you do that in your life all the time. You probably make way more wise decisions than you do unwise. You probably teach people to do the same thing. This isn't controversial at all to say that some decisions are wiser than another decision. So yeah, it is and this is, especially when Christianity, this doesn't seem controversial at all to me. Yes, it is a wiser, better decision to submit myself to Christ and put my fate in his hands and say, I can't do anything. I need you to save. I can't do anything about my sin. I can't help myself here. I can't save myself, and to throw myself at the mercy of Christ.
Wait.
That is a wise decision to do.
So by admitting that you can't do anything to earn your salvation, you just earned your salvation.
Right. And that's Stephen, that's ultimately what you have to say is it sounds like a good gotcha for you to say the difference between me and you is that in hell is the person you made a wise decision. Ha, got you. But when you think about it a little bit further, what you're saying is that me admitting that I can't save myself and throwing myself at the mercy who did what I couldn't do on the cross, then I've saved myself. And obviously, right. That's obviously ridiculous, right? Like, it's obviously ridiculous to say that I save myself by admitting I can't save myself.
Because if that's true, Stephen, and this is the thing we've tried to point out, if that's true, that making a wiser decision does save you, then why did Jesus need to die?
Right. So right. Romans 1, right? Paul is very clearly saying that everyone knows what a wise decision is. I'm going to paraphrase him, but people understand what wise and unwise is. That God's character has been shown to them. They know God. They know what is going on. That's objective moral values, right? Like William Lane Craig, baby. We know what is right. Intuitively, these are things that we know. And so we know that there are some decisions that are wiser than others. Does that save us? By no means. Just because the Jews made better decisions most of the time, they were God's people, they, were following him most of the time, does that mean they still don't need a savior? Of course not, Paul goes on to say.
Right. Well, and I think that's important to understand that when we continue to talk about how the responsibility we have to believe and trust in God doesn't remove the responsibility of God to save those who believe and trust in Him. And the prodigal son story is what we've used as an analogy for that. Is just to say, when the prodigal is on his way home, does he earn, or does he deserve what he's about to get?
No.
I think everybody knows that he deserves probably to be stoned in that culture, especially. What he gets is grace. He gets mercy. He deserves to be punished. The father refrains from punishing him. And not only does he not punish him, but he gives him a golden ring, the fatted calf. I mean, he throws him a party. He gives him, he is gracious beyond measure to a rebellious, undeserving child. So humbling yourself and returning home doesn't earn you anything. God's not obligated to receive you back when you come home. He chooses graciously to do that, and it's totally his choice. But the fact that it's 100% of God to whether he saves you or not doesn't remove your responsibility, 100% your responsibility to confess your sin and come home.
Same thing with the apology to your wife, right? You apologizing to your wife for that terrible thing you did doesn't earn her forgiveness. Absolutely.
Well, and Stephen makes the point there. He says, well, doesn't Scripture also say that God gives us faith? What about that, Eric? If you have faith in God, isn't that because God effectually gave you faith? Like he bore you again, he gave you new birth and made you.
But people have faith in all kinds of things, right? People have faith so much so in false religions that they are willing, they believe so hard in false things that they are willing to ram planes into buildings and strap bombs on their chests and blow themselves up in the name of faith, in the name of their strong faith. So he gave human beings the ability to have faith, and he gave us the God-shaped hole in your heart to need to fill it with something beyond yourself, some sort of meaning and purpose in your life. He gave that to us, and we can have faith in a chair that holds us up. We can have faith in false things. And so in that sense, he gave us faith. But again, what we do with it is up to us.
That's right. Well, and there's passages that some people have wrongly interpreted to mean that God effectuates or somehow causes faith. But
right.
I don't think that those passages
there's biblical,
hold water. And I would say, notice how the Bible doesn't refrain from saying Abraham's faith or you believed and it was credited to you. In other words, the Bible has no problem crediting the individual with the faith.
Right.
It never calls Peter's faith or the disciples' faith or lack thereof God's. And it really doesn't make a lot of sense for Jesus to marvel at their faith or their lack thereof if he's ultimately the one who's controlling the level of faith that they have.
And I know this is like a little snarky, like I admit this is a little bit snarky, but how many times does God have to say, if you do A, then I will do B, but if you do C, then I will do D? Like how that is a ubiquitous, all over the place theme in the Scriptures. I will respond to the thing that you do. How many times does he have to say that?
Right. Well, and as Josh points out here, Tim points out here, faith is a gift. We are responsible to practice our faith. Faith cometh by hearing, hearing by the word of God. God is not obligated to send his word, but having sent it, we're responsible for what we do with it. And so he grants us the ability to believe and repent by sending us the gospel of repentance. And so, yes, it's a gift in that sense, but since when does a gift have to be effectually given for the giver to get full credit for giving it? I think God should get credit for the gifts he's provided, even for those who deny him. I don't think we should try to insinuate that if somebody denies his gift, that he really didn't provide it for him, because that would take away some of his glory as the gift giver. Like I've said with the kids, if I bought all 4 of them MacBook Pros, which they should not expect because I don't have that kind of budget, but if I were to buy all of them computers, and 3 of them were to use it wisely and correctly as it was intended by the gift giver, and the other one was to treat it as a doorstop and to destroy it, shouldn't I still get the full glory as a father for the giver of gifts to all of my children? Just because the one child chose to use the gift I gave them for evil and for destruction, that shouldn't take away the glory due to the gift giver. And anytime anybody takes the truth of the gospel and suppresses it and despises it and treats it poorly, we shouldn't say, well, that's because God just didn't want that person, or God didn't provide.
Yeah, that puts the
grace.
Responsibility for that rejection on God. And that's kind of if you want to understand provisionism, that's just sort of a non-starter for us. You can't, that's the one of the core things we're trying to protect is removing the moral responsibility of rejecting him off of God for sin, off of God. That's kind of the non-starter for us.
Absolutely. And so we would just push back on that to say that we are responsible for what we do with the revelation God's given, and he has chosen to reveal himself graciously to all of us sufficiently so that we may respond positively to his provision. There are several side questions and remarks, and we'll get to some of those, but I wanted to get back a little bit more on the topic of the Hyper-Calvinist hunt that Eric was on. What are your findings and conclusion? I mean, I know you're still working through your final installment of this article. Maybe give us kind of a summary of your hunt for this elusive creature called the Hyper-Calvinist, and what practical implications and lessons can we learn from your hunt?
I think that I'm still very much open to seeing a robust dialogue within or without Reformed theology over the logical implications of their theology. That those who take it too far, who are they? How do they take it too far? Why do they take it too far? And what is the actual difference in between what they're saying and what you're saying? So far, I've only seen that they say, well, you just ought not to take it that far. That's not good enough for me. Horton says there are, guardrails. Well, there's guardrails, and we just ought not to go this way too far, and we ought not to go this way too far, because if you go this way too far, you're an Arminian, and if you go this way too far, you're a Hyper-Calvinist. And it's like, okay, your guardrails are great. I acknowledge those, but how is it irrational or inconsistent with your theology if someone does go higher than the guardrails? So I'm going to keep looking for someone who's having this discussion. I would love to have that discussion with that person, whoever it is. We could have them on. It would be great. We could actually have a Calvinist on and discuss with them. It'd be fantastic. If someone who is willing to name a Hyper-Calvinist, someone who has gone too far, and criticize them and say, hey, here's where you're wrong about Reformed theology and why it's different, why Hyper-Calvinism is actually rationally theologically different than Calvinism. So I'm going to keep looking. So far, all I see is that they use it as a scapegoat to deflect off our criticisms of them, even to the point of saying, like, yeah, you think this criticism is accurate, but it's not true of us, it's true of them, but who they are, no one knows. And then also just to control the language. And as long as you say that the gospel is sincerely given, the gospel offer is sincerely given, as long as you say that you can have assurance, as long as you talk in this way, you're a Calvinist. And and then what they do is they control the language in the sense of making us that we would have to talk like that. Well, if you don't talk like that, if you don't admit that Calvinism believes these things, then you're talking about Hyper-Calvinism. So they try to control the language debate, and they're trying to scapegoat it. So that's what I've found so far. I'm open to anyone giving me more information. I will continue my search. Okay. And to find one, and let's find one, and let's actually disagree with this person.
Timothy in the side chat said that they found a self-proclaimed Hyper-Calvinist, and maybe there are some weird groups out there. You'll have to go look at that.
Okay, I'm gonna let's do it.
And
copy that right now.
Yeah, and you can do that after our show. We can go look at that later.
Yeah.
But Nick asked this question about a conversation we had earlier. He says, but why does the making of the wiser decision to repent and follow Christ not merit boasting? I'm not earning my salvation. I still made the wiser decision. Is that not boastworthy? Well, the way I would reply to that is, if somebody humbles themselves so as to confess their inability to be saved by their own works, then for them to go boast in their humility, I think would reveal that the root of their humility wasn't genuine. It was a fake. It was a fake humility, because who boasts in humility? It's a kind of an oxymoron, boasting in your humility. That would be a faux humility. That would be a fake humility, which I'm sure is out there. I'm sure people pretend to be humble about stuff who aren't truly humble. But I assure you, this is not a big problem. It seems like it's like Austin Fisher says. It seems like the Calvinist is concerned with a man getting any stealing any of the glory from God, while the free will theist is more concerned about the character, protecting the character of
right.
God.
That's exactly what it is. Like I can fully admit that, it leaves open some room for boasting. Like I could see that you made a wiser decision, and so you can go around saying like, I didn't jump in front of a bus today. How wise am I? Like I guess you could go around doing that, and it'd
be like a prodigal son saying, hey guys, hey man, I took my dad's wealth and I squandered it, man. And dude, when I was in that pigsty, I was thinking to myself, man, I could be a slave in my father's house. And so I humbled myself, man, dude, I was really cool, man. You should have seen me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's possible. But then in order to avoid what I would consider like a little bitty problem, you create a much, much bigger problem, which sees God as, authoring the reprobation of the vast majority of humanity for all eternity.
Every rejection of the offer of grace is ultimately because God didn't want that person. It's because God didn't provide for that person.
You make the gospel not well meant. It creates so many problems.
Yeah, and so in order to avoid this one little small thing that people might be boasting in their humility, which would really be revealing that they were never truly humble, in my opinion. In other words, I don't think that could actually happen. If somebody's truly been broken, and I've been at that place in my life where I was just broken for my sin, I can just tell you, you're not going to go around saying, hey man, look at me, I'm just so awesome. It doesn't make any rational sense for people to boast in their humility. What you're boasting in, and the Bible actually calls for boasting. The Bible says you can boast. If you're going to boast in this. Boast that you know him. that's what it says to do. Yeah. You're actually able to boast in knowing him. And so that's what we're ultimately saying is, no, I didn't do this. But look at my father. Look at the kind of father I have. Despite my sin and shame, despite what I did with the squandering of the wealth, despite what I did to find myself in a pigsty, which is completely humiliating who I am, look at what my father did in the face of that. Not only did he forgive me, he didn't punish me, but he gave me a golden ring. He gave me sandals. He gave me a robe. He killed the fatted calf. Look at what am I going to boast in that story? I'm not going to boast in, well, I made this really good decision to come out of my pigsty. I'm going to boast in the response of the Father, the gracious Father, in that story. And so I don't see the whole room for boasting as a very good argument, and it's certainly not worth the implications that it causes to try to avoid it by saying you really aren't responsible for whether you humble yourself or not. It's really ultimately on God whether you humble yourself or not. I think you create a much bigger situation, a bigger issue with the gospel when you do that. Okay, so Stephen asked this question. He says, you being broken over your sin, did that come from yourself or from God? Well, okay, it's not either or. That's a false dilemma, because ultimately what you're saying is you're making it sound like it's either Leighton's just all by himself, like on an island, and he just starts getting broken. And just, oh man, I'm just broken all by myself. Okay, no, we're responders. God's initiator. Okay, he's the one who initiates. So if I'm responding to his appeal, he brings the law, which is a schoolmaster, a tutor, and I actually think the law has the ability to teach people things, and therefore I can recognize my sin, as Paul even said, when the law came, I died. What's he saying? Oh, when the law revealed my sin, I realized that I was separated from God. That's what it means by death. I'm separated from God, and so I'm responding to his light, his revelation. So where does it come from? God revealing himself to me, and then me responding to God. That's what we would talk about with
Yeah,
relationship.
it doesn't.
Back and forth.
It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen without that first thing, or God revealing Himself. So,
right, absolutely.
God designed us all to respond. That's right.
Yeah, He designs. We're responders. We're not initiators. We're responders, and that's what makes us responsible creatures, because we're able to respond to Him. And I don't believe He sends an insufficient message. If He sends a message to a lost person, then that message is sufficient for that lost person to respond to it. Otherwise, why send it? Doesn't make any sense to send a message to somebody who doesn't have the capacity to respond to that message, and then to judge them for eternity for how they respond to the message that they have no capability of responding differently to.
It's weak at best and duplicitous at worst. I mean, it's
It becomes very difficult to even begin to explain how culpability and blameworthiness, the whole punishment reward thing under Calvinism just becomes a head scratcher, because you've got God saying at the end, "Well done, my good and faithful servant, for what I created and caused you to do through effectual means, I guess." Or, "Depart from me, you worker of iniquity, who I created for being unable to respond to me, I guess." I mean, it just creates this dilemma, all for the purpose of, again, it seems like to me the only good intention you could get out of this is to avoid that boasting charge of making a wise decision. I mean, it seems like that's the best thing they get out of it.
I think what they're doing, I mean, this is a whole other rabbit hole, so I'll just say this and just like, I think just what they're doing is that they just can't go anywhere near Rome. It's just, if it sounds anything Catholic at all, they can't go there. I think that's what it is that if you can say that you can do something, then in their minds that imports all of Rome. It imports all of the Catholicism, all of that. Well, then the floodgates open and you're Catholics. And I think that's what it is.
And you caught me here. I'm looking up a verse for somebody. They were saying what verse talks about boasting and knowing the Lord. And I can't remember where it is. Boast that you know the Lord. Jeremiah 9:24. There it is. But let the one who boast about this, that they have understanding to know me, that I am the Lord, who exercise kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. For in these I delight, declares the Lord. So let me say that again. Let the one who boasts, well, let me just put it in the side chat too, for you to see it for yourselves, so that you can look for it. Jeremiah 9:24. It's going to go into two sections there. There it is. Okay, let the one who boast about this, that you have the understanding. So what are you boasting about? In other words, God's telling you it's okay to boast that what? You have understanding to know me. He's actually telling us we should boast about that. So why are you getting mad at provisionists for boasting that we know and understand what Jesus told us, if he tells us that we should boast in that? We should boast that he is the Lord. We should boast what? That he exercised kindness. That's exactly what provisionists boast about. God is kind. He's just. He doesn't show partiality. He's righteous. He's good. And this is something he delights in. So more power to you guys. I think Jeremiah 9:24 takes away the one thing you had going for you, is that you were trying to remove provisionists taking any credit for their salvation. And here Jeremiah 9:24, the Lord himself speaking, says it's okay for the provisionists to boast that they have understanding, that they know God. It's okay for the provisionists to boast that God exercised kindness and justice and righteousness. It's okay because he delights in that. So we've just taken away your one thing that you had to hang on to hang on to Calvinism. So become a provisionist.
The water's fine.
The water's good. It feels great. You'll feel so much better.
Come on in.
Well, this has been fun. We're coming on the 2-hour mark,
fun.
and so we've probably gone long enough. But God bless you guys for tuning in. Thanks for
that was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, Frank, Tim, Joel, Jay, Peter, for your donations. Appreciate you guys supporting, and of course all of our patrons that make this possible. and continue to continue to visit us at the Facebook pages. There at the Soteriology 101 Facebook page, the blog site, soteriology101.com. You can find there on the top line there the 2 articles that Eric has recently produced on his hunt for the elusive Hyper-Calvinist, as well as many other articles that are great for you to dive into. We just recently posted one. We reblogged one from some kind of a manor, duck manor, or some.
Did he email you?
He did, but I haven't replied to him yet.
Oh, okay, cool.
And he uses a pseudonym for his blog, but I thought he did a pretty good job. Manor Rabbit, that's what it was. Yeah. So
the second part of that's coming out on Thursday, and then he posted a third part, which I'll do too. So
cool. Yeah, I think he does a pretty objective. He even got onto me on one of the.
Yeah, he criticized you, which I was like,
yeah,
that was good. No, I mean,
so I'm good with it. Yeah, I even reblog people who criticize me. So there you go. That's how objective I can be. I'm boasting in my humility, really, right now, because I'm pretty much the humblest guy I know. Pretty much.
All right. We'll go. I'll let you.
You dig
the hole. You dig that hole.
You
farther.
just let me go along with that. All right.
Yeah, I'm just going to let you. I'm not going to stop you.
I'm going to hang myself on that one. Okay. All right. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time. Be good.
Somebody asked, how do you give? Become a patron.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Become a patron. You get exclusive content. You make this possible.
Yeah. You can do a one-time gift or become a patron, either one. If you go to soteriology101.com, the support link in the top right corner, you click on that and it walks you through how to do that. It even gives you an address if you'd rather send a check. We prefer, obviously, the other way because it's less work for us behind the scenes if you can just donate through that way. But we appreciate the donations. It make things like this possible. Some of y'all can't see this, but let me just, since we're closing here, see that little microphone right there? That help. We can buy things like that. And Eric's going to be doing some things with us too. And he helps support our time and energy and effort. I couldn't get him to help us in some of those things and employ him part-time to do these things for us. The way we grow, the way we market.
Yep, I appreciate
it. Yeah, all the things we're doing comes through people getting behind us. And if we're even going to have a hope of having a chance against the behemoth websites out there that are promoting Calvinistic soteriology, then we're going to have to get people to be willing to collaborate and help each other and to work together for what we consider to be the God's provision and love for all. So that's only going to happen if we can give and help make it happen. So I appreciate those who are doing that. And we honestly, I know we say it a lot. Almost every show I say some kind of a thanks for our givers, but I can't say it enough because it really wouldn't happen without you guys. So with that said, God bless. We'll see you next time. Be good.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. God bless.